Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for being here with us today for MEMO's Crowdcast event in collaboration with Society for Renaissance Studies, and it's the memo on the global Renaissance and the Islamic worlds. Today we very excitingly have with us Professor Jyotsna Singh and Dr. Amrita Sen. So before I hand over to Amrita and let the conversation commence, I'm just going to say a few very quick words about MEMOs and what we do and what our aims are, and then about an upcoming MEMOs project that's quite exciting that's in the works. So Medieval and Early Modern Orients, we launched in June 2020, and we were founded by Lubaba Al-Azami, who is our founding editor, and our deputy editor, Samir Hassan. And we are an AHRC-funded decolonial project that seeks to further knowledge and understanding of the early interactions between England and the Islamic worlds. And through our pages and our blog posts, which are written by our very diverse international research team, as well as some really fantastic guest bloggers, we hope to create an accessible space in which to reveal the exciting discoveries of researchers as they look at elements of history and literature, and they investigate the intersecting webs of our pasts. And like the engagements that we explore here at MEMOs, we also seek to be a point of engagement and a space in which researchers, practitioners, colleagues, specialists, and just generally anybody that has an interest in medieval and early modern Anglo-Islamic interactions can stay up to date with news and events in the field. And by doing all of this, we just hope to build a network of knowledge and appreciation around the long-standing global relationships that continue to define our interconnected identities and the way in which they shape the world we live in today. So we hope that since we've launched, we hope that we're contributing and are going to continue to contribute to an enriching and empowering understanding of our collective pasts, presents, and futures. And now seems like quite a good time just to very quickly talk about an edited collection that MEMOs are doing that we have coming up. It's called Materializing the East in Early Modern English Drama, which I'm co-editing alongside another member of our MEMOs research team, Dr. Murat Ökçe. And the collection, basically, it aims to re-examine the misrepresentations and the representations of the East in early modern English outdoor and indoor stages. And we hope that this will broaden our understanding of early modern theatrical productions beyond and aside from Shakespeare and beyond the European continent as well. So for this purpose, the chapters in the volume analyze how the material aspects of stage architecture, costumes, props, staging effects, how they affect the conceptualization of the East on the early modern English outdoor and indoor stages. And all of the chapters emphasize these material aspects that I've drawn upon of dramatic performances, and they deal with, as I said, non-Shakespearean plays spanning from the Elizabethan, Jacobean, Caroline, all the way to the Restoration periods. And we have already received confirmation that Arden Bloomsbury will publish our volume as part of their Early Modern Studies in Drama series, which is edited by Lisa Hopkins and Douglas Brewster. So we feel very incredibly happy and privileged to have this wonderful platform to via which to disseminate our work. And then among the many wonderfully knowledgeable contributors, our afterword will actually be written by the wonderful Professor Jyotsna Singh. So we feel absolutely privileged that someone of your esteem has agreed to write this important part of the collection. So we're very happy to have you involved with that. And over the past couple of months, Murat and I have been receiving some really fantastic chapters from the contributors, and we're aiming to send a full draft of the manuscript over to Bloomsbury within the next couple of weeks. So we're well on track to making this publication, and hopefully this will be something to look forward to from Memo's content to look forward to from us towards the tail end of this year. So yeah, thank you. And I'll just hand over now to Amrita.
Thank you so much, Aisha. It's a great privilege for me to have this conversation today with Professor Jyotsna Singh, who is Professor of Renaissance Literature and Culture in the Department of English at Michigan State University. Her published works include Colonial Narratives, Cultural Dialogues, Discoveries of India in the Language of Colonialism from Routledge in 1996, Shakespeare and Postcolonial Theory, Bloomsbury Arden 2019, Travel Knowledge, co-edited with Evo Kamps from Palgrave in 2001, The Weyward Sisters, Shakespeare and Feminist Theory, co-edited with Timpna Callahan and Lorraine Helms, Blackwell Wiley, 1994. She's also the editor to A Companion to the Global Renaissance, also from Wiley Blackwell in 2009, and is the co-editor of the second expanded and revised edition of A Companion to the Global Renaissance. With David Kim, she has also co-edited The Postcolonial World and is the author of numerous book chapters and articles. She also serves as co-editor for a book series, New Transculturalisms, 1400 to 1800, which is a Palgrave series with Miyoko Suzuki and Rosalind Jones. This series seeks to promote transcultural and transnational perspectives across disciplines, to consider interconnectedness between race, ethnicity, and gender, sexuality, nationality, and religion, emerging from and shaping ongoing global exchanges and transformations in the pre-modern world. Professor Singh has also been the recipient of several visiting fellowships, including at Queen Mary University of London in 2008, the John Carter Brown Library, Brown University 2010. Most recently, she was elected a visiting fellow at St. Catherine's College, Oxford in 2019. And on a more personal note, might I add that she was also the amazing and wonderful supervisor for my PhD. So, as I said, this truly is a privilege to have Jyotsna here and to have this conversation with her. And I want to start off by talking about how you're one of the pioneers in bringing post-colonial theory to the early modern world and to early modern studies. And I'm thinking about the larger corpus of your work, beginning with your individual essays on Shakespeare and India, but also thinking about colonial narratives and cultural dialogues, and actually have this well-read version of your book with me. And one of the things that always struck me as so important about your first monograph was the way in which it spoke about early modern encounters, it spoke about Shakespeare, but say, as opposed to some of the other canonical works like Gauri Vishwanathan's Masks of Conquest, we just looked at Shakespeare and Indian education. Your work actually, very importantly, provides a long durée vision where you aren't just looking at the 19th century, where a lot of scholars sort of focus on whenever they're talking about post-coloniality, but instead you go further back in time to one of the very first moments of sort of English and European encounters with India, with Mughal India, and you sort of provide this really important and amazing trajectory of the evolving relationship between the English world and the Mughal world and later 19th century India. And I was just wondering what made you strike out in this direction. If you could say a bit more about this journey, I mean, why bring post-colonial theory? How did you bring post-colonial theory into early modern studies at a time when it just wasn't being done?
Okay, well, thank you so much. Let me thank the wonderful memos people, and I am delighted to be writing this afterward. I've read all those essays, and it's going to be a brilliant series. I'd also like to thank the Society for Renaissance Studies and all my, friends and people I don't know. I think it's wonderful to gather here, and I'm very grateful. And I'm just a little kind of um, people don't think of me as a shy person, but this kind of makes me a little awkward to be presenting myself. I think I'll just tell the story of my work, which can help others, junior scholars, that I didn't start from a theoretical vantage. I came to the US actually to study American literature. And I took one class on metaphysical poetry with Jean Howard, and it changed my universe. So I came to Renaissance studies through metaphysical poets. And I think in many ways, Herbert and Donne are still my favorite poets. And then it was a very exciting time to be, so the late 80s, early 90s was when there was a paradigm shift. There was new historicism, cultural materialism, the wonderful feminist work, Kate Belsey, Jean Howard, Kate McCluskey, Lisa Jardine, and people like Peter Hume, people like Jonathan Dollimore. So the other thing I'd like junior scholars to know, that none of us write in a void. We are a part of these communities. And today I'm going to try and mention people as much as I can, but obviously I leave people out. So around this time when I was finishing, I was a sort of adrift as to why am I doing this? And I met this wonderful Indian woman at a conference who said, why don't you look at what happened to Shakespeare in India? And literally that began my journey, in which I started looking at Shakespeare productions actually in Calcutta, in Bengal. And so that was the first piece I published. Second, and I would like to praise both the Shakespeare Association and Renaissance Society, because I think they have become very inclusive and they have come a long way. But in the 90s, they were not as, they were, if I can say, sort of more white spaces and more elitist spaces. So it was not a world that I felt that I could get a job in or I was a part of. But I began this journey of looking at Shakespeare in India and looking at, what happened and how was I formed as a post-colonial subject. The second interest that evolved at the same time was travel writing. And there are wonderful people in the audience here who are now great, scholars and writers of travel studies and travel writing. I'm seeing Natalia and others here. And so that, to me, I realized that the English weren't sitting in England or Europeans weren't sitting there, but they were traveling. So my colonial narratives, and that's another great personal story. And there was this wonderful woman who I should have invited, is Talia Rogers at Routledge, and Janice Price. And they had commissioned me to write a book only on Shakespeare in India. And I just poked around libraries in England and the book grew. And they were wonderful. And I didn't start with the idea of 19th century chapter or the 20th century chapter. I think publishing was more fluid and flexible in those days. And I don't think that may happen now. But I think when I was doing my post-colonial theory book recently, it all just made sense that there is a through line between, the 19th century and early modern, but of course it's not a through line of teleology. It's a through line of, what Subramanian would call sort of connected histories. And I can come back to that and to sort of post-colonial and early modern, into some of your other questions as the conversation goes. But at the end, it's always a personal journey. Intellectual life is a part of your personal journey. And that's how I always see myself. And I think it's just more fun like that.
No, I seriously, I always wanted to know this story as to, how this specific book came across, because uh, colonial narratives has been a great influence on my work, and I'm sure on the work of, other younger scholars of early modern travel literature, of Shakespeare, but also to scholars of color. And, sort of going off of what you said about Sanjay Subramaniam's um, interconnected histories sort of come in a really important way in the global Renaissance. And in your introduction to A Companion to the Global Renaissance. And in fact, you coined the term the global Renaissance, right? And for those who haven't read it's an amazing chapter where you're sort of uh, comparing Elizabeth and other European princes with the princes of the Islamic world, with Jahangir, but also that wonderful image that you have of Jahangir and Shah Abbas sort of embracing one another on this globe. And you talk about this sort of global awareness, this global consciousness, which, contrary to what we have been trained to think about, was not a Western phenomena. And so I was wondering why you felt the need for a new term, why you felt the need for global renaissance. Uh, and I ask this because, when we were, I asked this question because, say, when we were undergraduates in India, the term that we used was, of course, the Renaissance. That is how we had traditionally been taught to think about the 16th and 17th centuries. But that, of course, went through a paradigm shift, and the term early modern became really familiar uh, within Anglo American academia. But after my return to India, I've realized that it's also a term that is gaining a lot of currency in the Indian subcontinent. So, why the term global renaissance then? Why go back to the Renaissance and why bring in the global? It's an amazing term, which I use a lot with my students as well. But I think I want to know the histories behind
Sure.
these journeys, these terms.
And again, I think that's again a sort of personal history. Is in 2008, I was at Queen Mary, and I had the most wonderful. So there's a shout out for Queen Mary, University of London, and it's the most amazing cosmopolitan campus, and a lot of students from all over London from different communities. And again, I met an editor from Wiley at the Shakespeare, Emma Bennett, and I kept saying, talking about travel writing, because in 2001, Ivo Kamps and I had already co-edited Travel Knowledge. So we were already kind of doing global work. And that was, I was originally from Holland and I'm from India. So we were looking at our own colonial pasts in that. And that was a very great, wonderful project where we looked at. So we began to think of it globally. And and there was wonderful scholars who I invited, like Matthew Dimmock, who's here, and Nandini Das, and I can name many others. And basically, we were raised, in my generation, is the whole Burkhart's notion of the Renaissance man. I think we all forget that it was the Italian Renaissance, 14th 15th century. Italy was the center of that world. It was a 19th century book. But it was a celebration, and it was the birth of modernity, and and the Renaissance man. It was very male. I think we all read that book, and so that was very European. And actually, if you looked on the ground, so to speak, the Renaissance, the world was already in travel, trade, exploration. This quote unquote discovery was already global. And so, in a way, I think it started as an exploration, like all my other work. And gradually, we began to realize that, England wasn't there. And the second edition is really important, which I edited, because this is not only English. And that is why the picture of Jahangir on a globe is outside and Queen Elizabeth is inside the book, to show that the whole European world was globally engaged. Second, I think work like this brings in communities of color, communities who are outside or outside the metropolitan centers. It doesn't always have to be communities of color, but people who are not elites, to recognize that they are there. And thirdly, which is a passion which I've talked about, and that's why I'm such a fan of memos, is I am deeply interested in the Islamic world. I am not a Muslim myself, I'm a Sikh, but we in India, unlike today when we have our Indian government, I won't mention, we grew up in a deeply syncretic culture. And I believe that the three, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals left, I think, the most amazing cultural products forever. The cultural production, the cosmopolitanism, the discussions about, quote unquote, diversity, and was just phenomenal. So for me, the global Renaissance was countering the Renaissance man, the Italian centric. I love Italian art and culture, but it was much more. So it was just enlarging, expanding the world as we look at it. I hope.
And this is fascinating, Jyotsna. And I mean, what I find really intriguing about the global Renaissance is the way that sort of you bring in Jahangir as a really important actor in everything that is happening during this time period, which again is not a narrative that we usually get, is not a history that we usually get, especially amongst a lot of literary scholars and a lot of literary criticism. And not just thinking about Jahangir, but also about Gulbadan Begum, who is Baba's daughter and sister to Humayun. She is raised by Maham Begum, who is Humayun's mother, and goes on to have a really important position within the Mughal domestic space, and writes Humayun Nama at Akbar's urgings. And you've written about her as well. And sort of going back to what you said about travel writing and sort of bringing travel writing into focus, part of what you do is also bring in Gulbadan Begum as a travel writer, as an important figure to consider within this sort of larger narratives, and again, the sort of interconnected histories that we were talking about. And so I was wondering if you could say a bit more as to why these figures from the Islamic world are so important to our understanding of the global Renaissance.
Thank you. So let me go back to my first, engagement with Thomas Roe's visit to India in the Mughal court, which is what I wrote about in Colonial Narratives. Now, as you and I know, we all grew up reading about Mughals in Indian history, though, as I said, Indian history these days has changed, in ways that is not very good. And so we knew about the Mughals, but when I read about Roe's account of Jahangir, I followed since then to most recently, I did an essay in a wonderful anthology called The Trading Companies by Guido Meersbergen and others on William Hawkins, who was the ambassador before. He was the informal, he wasn't a formal, in Jahangir's court. So one of my projects in the last decade has been to look at different accounts, and I'm not the only one. There's great scholarship. Nandini Das and others have looked at how these travelers looked at the Mughal court. There's also very fine work on the Portuguese Jesuits in the Mughal court, by João Vicente Melo, he has a great chapter in the Global Renaissance about these relationships. So I think what we learn in the process is we learn about the court and we learn about the Mughals, and those voices come out. And Gulbadan Begum is very fascinating because the travelers don't mention her. She's mentioned a little bit because she had the ships and she's mentioned by the Portuguese, but she is not, they don't talk about her that like the way they talk about Roe. But she's left her own memoir, which was translated by Annette Beveridge in the 19th century, early 20th century. And now, of course, there's a great chapter, and I'll give a plug to it, is Lubaba's chapter in this new collection of memos, which is looking at, Jahangir's mother, that Mughal women were business women, and, Mariam al-Zamani. And so her thesis, and I would just like to stress, her thesis is really important because she's saying we always used to look at the East in a kind of Orientalist symbolic way as feminine or as the woman. But she is bringing, into her argument, real women. And so what I had done with the Gulbadan chapter, which was, earlier, some years ago, I think she really makes an amazing case. I'm just summing up the article, but you will read it. And I think I'm sure there's a lot of really good work on Jahan Ara Begum, on Noor Jahan, I think, who also she mentions. So my work is not, coming out of nowhere. There's Ruby Lal's work. There's Anne-Marie Schimmel's work, who have done amazing work. But I think it's coming to the forefront through, groups like Memos. And so it's always a question just of foreground and background. Everything is here. And as I stressed before, whenever I give talks these days or in the last few years, I always like to mention lots and lots of names of people who I've read and who worked. Because I think ultimately, my legacy is not only, books I've written or events like this, but any legacy that any one of us have is in work that other people are doing. So the conversation that I started about Gulbadan, Lubaba's taken it far afield. And that's why, when she asked me to do this event, I was really interested in doing that, in citing other people. So I think I would very much, just like to stress that. And anybody I miss, but I just like to cite people. So
yeah, and also...
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I think I just wanted to stress that my current project, which got delayed because of the pandemic, and I hope to get back to Oxford, is I want to look at why the English travelers, European travelers who all wrote about Mughals, never really mentioned the Chishtis. The Chishtis were the Sufi saints venerated by the Mughals, and they are great. They are amazing shrines and dargahs to them. And we know that Akbar, walked to Ajmer. Koriyat mentions them, and they are in Mughal paintings. There are references to them in Mughal biographies, in Tuske Jahangiri and in Akbarnama, but they are missing in European accounts. So to me, what is happening in these three Islamic kingdoms, I think, is very important way to expand our understanding of what was the Renaissance. It was the same period as Queen Elizabeth and King James. So they were all contemporaries. They were writing letters to each other, and the Ottoman sultans. My work is more in Mughals, but they're great scholars. There's Abdul Hamid Arvas. There's Matthew Dimmock, who's here in the audience. So my and that's what I want to encourage others to think about, is the Renaissance as both European and Islamic, in a way, standing on the same globe, though in different places.
Right. And actually thinking about women in the Islamic worlds, Bernadette Andreas writes a lot about Ottoman women as well as the Safavid women. And it's sort of very interesting to connect the women from these three Islamic empires, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. But sort of um, thinking more about, well, actually, I had two related questions. One is that, do you think we should read Mughal accounts, Mughal historiographic texts more? Do you think we should include those in early modern curriculum? So the Tuzuke Jahangiri, Akbarnama, Jahangirnama, Gulbadan Begum, because it seems from what you're telling us is that they sort of provide a sort of very interesting counter narrative to what Terry and Roe are talking about and doing, as you know, you and uh, Nandini Das and Anya Lumba and others sort of point towards. So, do you think we need to reorient our curriculum? I think is what I'm asking essentially.
I think that we need to have more conversations, as we did at the World Shakespeare Conference, between post-colonial studies and critical race studies. I think that's a really, and there is some, for instance, in the work of Imtiaz Habibi, who wrote the Black Lives in the English archives. So I think if we have more conversations between and those fields, then we should have definitely Mughals and Islamic histories in the curriculum. I regularly teach, I've taught it several times, called Early Modern Islam in the West. And there's another figure who's amazingly a kind of, Subramaniam calls them passeurs, they're kind of the mediating figures. And that is Leo Africanus. I teach his wonderful biography by Natalie Davis in many of my classes, so that we bring together the Mughal world. I've made students read translations of Tuske Jahangiri and Roe together. And sometimes, for students in the US, it's quite, quote unquote, exotic and quite different. And there are different kinds of resistances in the classes about reading the Mughals, and they wonder why it's important and what does it have to do with our issues of our times. And so my general approach in pedagogy is expansion. Let's make the tent larger. Let's bring in more conversations. Let's have discussions between these different areas, like sexuality and gender studies. There's amazing work being done there. In Islam, again, I mentioned Abdul Hamid Arvas and others, and other, great work done on sexuality and embodiment by people like Valerie Traub. So I think definitely I try to bring the Islamic worlds, and also, which is not, my area of expertise, all the stuff on North Africa and on, people who go back in the Middle Ages, on Moorish Spain. So what I'm trying to say is that in early modern pedagogy, we can certainly have a component that deals with, race, religion, and Islam. And, Kim Hall, for instance, has written so eloquently about race and religion in Othello. And so I think certainly they should be in conversations and dialogues with each other.
Right. Do you also feel that we need newer translations of these texts? I mean, the translations that we have are, I think they belong to a different political climate than the one that we are living in now. And I keep wondering about the language. I keep wondering about Farsi or Turkish words and how they are being interpreted. And if there had been new translations now, whether we would be reading them anew or, reading them slightly differently.
I think you've picked on dissertation projects and on translation projects. As Subramaniam, I think definitely the translations we have are really 19th century translations by colonial administrators. Annette Beveridge, Henry Beveridge, all of these were, the main translations, a lot of the East India Company materials have all come from the 19th century.
Yeah.
And so there's great room. I think there may be some people in this audience here who can speak very good Farsi, who could do some modern translations with modern introductions. And I'd like to give a plug for a new translation of Montserrat by João Vicente Melo, who's not here in the audience. And the last translation of Montserrat, he was the Jesuit who went to the Mughal court and wrote an account of Akbar, was I think in 1922. So it was by Hoyland. Wow. Yeah, so there was a 1922 translation, and then there's this new one. And so I wish I was good at languages. I would maybe should spend the rest of my life doing translations. But you're absolutely right. Not only new translations, but new annotations, new introductions. And I'm, I know Ruby Lal speaks languages, but I think she's still working. Maybe she's doing some translation herself, I think, in her book on the Mughal women, if I'm correct. I'm not sure all of the translation is hers. And Anne-Marie Schimmel is worth looking at what translation she's using. But as far as I know, Thaxton has the new editions, the Babur. That is a new translation. That is really good. I would definitely recommend that. So, I'm not an expert, but I certainly would encourage translations that actually look critically at the 19th century translations, that evaluate them in their term. And I'm sure there are people here in the audience who know much more about this than I do.
Well, thinking about the 19th century and 19th century or even 18th century perceptions of the East, of Islamic worlds, and was thinking of Said and postcolonial theory as we know it is deeply indebted to Edward Said, and it's been around 44 years now since Orientalism first came out. And so would you say that Said is still relevant?
Yes, Said, I think the two major influences that have shaped my work, Edward Said was seminal, and more recently, Sanjay Subramaniam. And then I would also like to mention, as I always do, the kind of work that came out in the 80s and 90s by feminists, by new historicists, cultural materialists. I think those are the shaping influences. There are two arguments about Said. One is they suggest that he produced this binary of colonizer, colonized. And I think that's a very reductive reading, because he made the Orient visible to us. He showed how discourse, he was coming from Foucault, which is another, Foucault is the giant for my times. And so that was in itself valuable. And it's up to us how capacious we make that formulation. And I think coming back to this new collection of memos, the materializing the East, I think they are looking at that trope, but they're complicating it. They're looking at it in its complexities. So I think he can then segue to what Subramaniam is saying about the more dense, complicated connection between macro and micro histories. I think I'm talking too fast here. But more importantly, when people say, Said only wrote about the 18th and 19th century and we are just applying him to the past. And that's a very respectable argument. I just don't agree with it, because I think even in the 16th and 17th centuries, and many people and myself have written, there was a kind of colonizing imagination at work. There were rhetorical tropes, there were structures. So I think certainly we can apply Said both to the past and also to use his initial formulation to kind of look at these relationships and these tropes. And look at Orientalism and Orientalizing impulses and tendencies in different kinds of texts. So Said, to me, is absolutely crucial. And I, as a graduate student, did a criticism in theory seminar with him. And I should just mention it. His main point always was, we all need to read more books. And he was not polemical. And it was always about, we need to read more books. So I think maybe that's a lesson, we would say. But I would certainly say that there are ways to use him and apply him and critique, what may have been the limitations of his book at that time.
Right. I mean, just thinking about what you just said, there's something that struck me, which is that one of the criticisms leveled against Said, but also against subcontinental post-colonial theory, is that it sort of only looks at the lens of the colonizer and does not attribute agency to the colonized, or it does not sort of attribute agency to indigenous cultures. And I was thinking that global renaissance and the way that global renaissance is formulated, I think opens up the possibility of us listening to the other voices as well, and of including the other voices, because the entire premise, of course, of the global renaissance is that it is not something that is the domain of any one or singular culture, but is rather, a worldwide phenomena during this time period. So I mean, would you say that your formulation of the global renaissance sort of adds to what Said has been had started us thinking about, started us off on this journey or trajectory?
I mean, I think, and I again should give a plug to Anya Lumba's work, who is ahead of me and is very important in shaping, post-colonial perspectives on global renaissance. She and I were on a panel some months ago. It was very interesting to have a conversation. I think the way I see especially in the second edition of the global renaissance, is increasingly, I don't want to see colonialism as a monolithic juggernaut, that there was a teleology from the 16th century later on. And I'm very interested in looking at the sort of macro and micro histories of both individual actors and the larger forces and the trade policies. And I've written on the early English slave trade, for instance. It was a combination of many influences and factors. So the important thing is to give voices to people, or to give voices to different actors, is to have an overview that doesn't have this totalizing perspective. And I want to mention and give a plug here, which you had mentioned earlier, is Bernadette Andrea. She and Patricia Kime did the book on travel, and Bernadette has done very pioneering work on women travelers in Islam, and there's an essay of hers in the Global Renaissance too. And I think so she went out and captured those voices. So one of the things, as scholars located in the West, if we are not writing in those languages, I think we can reclaim and bring in those voices into our discussions. And the work, for instance, on women and Islam that Bernadette and others have done and are doing is really important. So certainly, I'd also like to mention the afterword to the Global Renaissance by a really important scholar, Aisha Ramachandran, where she's using the term global lyric thinking, not global lyric thinking. And that's a term I've used in other talks recently, and I would recommend people to read that, where she's talking of also looking at the phenomenology of lived experience and release the lyric thinking voices. So I think my aim is more, in my current work, is to try and look for those lyric voices and lyric thinking. And again, one thing I'd like to share with junior scholars is that, at least in my own trajectory, one is always changing and evolving. And I think people always think, oh, you wrote a certain book and, you're known for colonial narratives and that's your worldview. And I think, and often scholars are kind of pushed to stick to one worldview. Mm. I feel that we should always be rethinking our worldview. And I can talk a bit about that. It's sort of as when we end, about the work I'm currently doing and where I'm going now. So in some ways, I was more, and I'll share this with you, which might amuse the audience. I was much more Marxist, and I think now I'm more of a Sufi. I'm thinking in slightly bigger terms, I guess, as one grows older and whatever. So I'll just share that with you here.
That's wonderful, Jyotsna. Absolutely wonderful. But I was thinking if we could shift gears a bit, and we've been talking so far about the global Renaissance and encounters of England and the Indian subcontinent, the Mughal Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries. But uh, if you could go back to Shakespeare and your work on Shakespeare and Shakespeare adaptations, which is, you know, you're also one of the very first people to talk about early adaptations, and your work is sort of very important in that aspect, as well as is the work of, say, Poonam Trivedi or Shobishta Paja, and then Parmita Kapadia and Craig Dion and their sort of new book on Bollywood Shakespeare's. But you talk about uh, sort of earlier performances of Shakespeare as well as contemporary performances. And I'm thinking of different Shakespeares, the Bard in colonial India, also postmodern and post-colonial Shakespeares, more or less Othello under surveillance, Calcutta 1848, which is one of my personal favorites because it talks about Boishtok Charan Arden, who is one of the very first figures in India, one of the very first colored figures to play the role of Othello on the Indian stage. But I'm also thinking about your essay, Othello's Identity, Postcolonial Theory, and Contemporary African Rewritings of Othello, where you talk about adaptations of the play, including Type Sully's Season of Migration to the North, which was published in 1968. And I was thinking, because global Shakespeare is now such an important subfield within Shakespeare studies, right? Which was not the case even a decade earlier. And there are not only amazing work and criticism coming out on global Shakespeare, as I said, I was thinking here about, Poonam Trivedi, but also most recently Shudashil Sen. But global Shakespeare is now also a digital presence, right? And you have the MIT Global Shakespeare's Archive, curated by Alexa Alice Jubin and Peter Donaldson. You also have the Asia in Shakespeare. Sort of. Just one of the guys down here. Just 1 second. You also have. So you also have the Asia archive, which sort of looks at South Asian sort of Shakespeare's in particular. But I was wondering how global Renaissance relates to global Shakespeare's. Okay. And if you could say a bit about that.
Well, thank you for listing all the people who've done important work in global Shakespeare's. Again, I think when I wrote my chapter on, the essay on Othello, and I thank the great volume of, Women, Race and Writing by Margot Hendricks and Pat Parker. I mean, that has had an anniversary, and that was very formative. And I was very grateful. I was a graduate student when they invited me to do that essay. And the novel Season of Migration is just so compelling, and it's so disturbing, and it's so seductive, and it's just amazing in all kinds of ways. And I think these were just journeys to try and understand Othello's identity, literally, who was he? Was he a Moor? Was he African? Was he Muslim? Through this dialogue. And that essay has been reprinted and cited, I think, probably a lot of my early work. And I think that was a journey that I began. But as you say, people brought their own experiences and identities to this work. So Poonam Trivedi, there was other really important work that was done in South Africa. Martin Orkin was doing this work. I mean, he was such a pioneer, and he passed away a few years ago. He wrote this essay, Othello and the Black Face of Racism. So there was global work being done, far before me. And I think we kind of picked on the times and were able to sort of capture moments of that paradigm. And now I'd like to mention also, which, didn't come up, is the work on global cinema. The Vishal Bhardwaj and Mark Burnett has written these amazing book on, Hamlet and the different global productions.
Yeah.
And they organized this wonderful conference where Poonam and I and Paromita were there on women and Indian Shakespeares, or Indian Shakespeares and women. I can't remember the title. And Thea Buckley was there. So this is a really exciting worldwide phenomenon that has brought all these people. And Craig Dion's Native Shakespeares, I think, is seminal. That was an amazing book. I cite it all the time. But I'd like to make one slightly kind of professorial, snarky comment here. I think I welcome all this global Shakespeare's work, but I sometimes worry that some of this work is moving too far away from the original texts. And we've been at many conferences of global Shakespeare because there is the original text, and there is the Shakespearean language, and you can move along those trajectories. But I would also encourage junior scholars to not abandon the original text, the originary moments, and early history. And one other point I'd like to make, which is I'm often asked, why do I still use the word Renaissance? We should use early modern because it comes with all the baggage of certain kind of, white criticism and associations with European hegemony. And I still use the term selectively because I think Renaissance also involves the humanist culture, which was a part of what the Renaissance was. That was very formative in many things. So I'm always reluctant to completely erase one term unless it's totally problematic. For instance, I never use the word slave in my writings on travel, on enslavement narratives. I try to avoid that because that suggests essentialist identities on people who were enslaved. So that's just a little aside about rhetoric and terminology. But global Renaissance movement, I think, is wonderful. Global Shakespeare movement is wonderful. And we saw it at the World Shakespeare Congress, the great productions of The Tempest, of Othello. There was the Esra conference in Greece, which had great Greek productions of Winter's Tale. So that's really wonderful for the world today to have these productions.
And how do you think global Shakespeare sort of relates to, say, race before race and critical race theory, which is sort of becoming so important, again, not only in Anglo-America, but is also taking on new life elsewhere globally. So I was really wondering if you could say a bit about that.
Yeah, that's really, I want to give a plug for Race Before Race and the amazing work they are doing in Arizona State. And I want to talk in a larger sense of work that is done in communities across the world. So one great community that is evolved is Race Before Race, which is really looking at pre-1800 through the lens of critical race theory, and led by Ayanna Thompson and Joyce McDonald and Ian Smith and Kim Hall. I mean, they're all, some of them are my contemporaries. And then there's Tide, travel and transculturality and identity, run by Nandini Das, which was in Oxford. And then there's the Tiskinia Chaka Center in South Africa and the University of Witwatersrand. And they're all doing, in some ways, work that deals with race, empire, colonization, and I think there are conversations between them. Obviously, work that's in the US is centered on some US or border concerns, there's whole border studies. However, I would like to state that I think it was the Black Lives Matter movement that I think mobilized the whole world. While quote unquote race work was being done before, but that became a kind of mobilizing call for the whole world. And I hope there'll be more conversation, just as the Me Too movement became a mobilizing movement for women, work on gender, sexuality, on trans studies, which is another very important field. So I think I'm just interested in communities and conversations and acknowledging the people on the barricades, who raised this call, like the Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement. And so, it's not, I would be the last person to try and pin one movement, but I applaud the work that's emanated from the Race Before Race very much, and how it can inform our understanding.
Right. And, before we sort of wrap up this part of our conversation and open things up to the Q&A, I was wondering if you could say a bit about your current projects. You did mention The Tempest, which you are co-editing with Matt Dimmock, but we also really wanted to know about the other amazing things that you might be doing, that you might be up to.
I have 3 projects, and one, since both MJ Kidney, who was our editor, and Matthew Dimmock is here, which I'm really excited about, is we are going to be editing the new edition of The Tempest for Cambridge. And Matt is I will learn from Matt. He is more skillful than I am. But I think how we conceptualize this edition is different from where I began my career with The Tempest, because I also wrote on The Tempest. I think my article on Tempest and Postcolonialism is on the British Library website. So in a way, these are the 2 bookends of my career. And so we had lots of discussions about where we want to go, and we definitely want to have a global edition of The Tempest, and hoping to link it through their platform to performances, and also go back to the play. And I just want to say something, as somebody who began my career by looking at how these plays are informed by colonial ideology, I worry whether we are flattening literature into ideology too much. Literature has a space of political energies, and literature cannot and should not be ideologically flattened. Although, you can say my original essay on Othello was ideologically driven to prove the point of racism. So we hope, in this edition, to look for what makes The Tempest. What about the music? What about Caliban's dreams? Without erasing the colonial interpretations of The Tempest that have come, including my own. And I would stress that, when I started work on The Tempest, there were some amazingly, I would say, racist readings of The Tempest that would be published everywhere, where everything that Prospero did was completely vindicated and praised. And they were, Tempest is a problematic play in terms of history of colonization. But I think it has many layers of complexity, and we want to hear global voices on The Tempest, is how it's been appropriated. There's this great collection by Bill Sherman called The Tempest and Its Travels. So this is a journey we've just begun. The second project that I want to do is a book where I mentioned looking at English travelers in the Mughal world, and looking at the Chishtis, the Sufi stuff that is missing. And in that, also looking at Mughal cities. I think I'm kind of interested in looking at how architecture was represented. And this is a project I've been working on. And last but not the least, recently only I gave a talk on Shakespeare sonnets and Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who is, I think, he's a poet as great as Shakespeare. And those of you who are Urdu speaking will know what I mean. And so I want to generate conversations between different kinds of poetry, and again, come back to literature. So that's where I would say that I am rethinking my very, I think, more radical political persona, and trying to see what are the political kind of energies that we find in reading literature. The reading of experience of literature is not the same as reading a political document. Literature makes you think in many different ways, as Aisha Ramachandran has said, lyric voices, and especially the lyric. I'm interested in what is happening in the lyric. Who is speaking, and what are the different kinds of subjectivity. So these are just sort of 3 different projects, and some of them are coming from the past, and some I'm moving in other directions. And I think I would love to hear from the audience. I've sort of rambled on, but I would like to stress that I was more of a Marxist and I'm more of a Sufi now, for good or for ill. You can make what you want of that. So thank you so much. You made me think of my everything a lot. Thank you.
I always love chatting with you, Jyotsna. It sort of raises so many questions. It sort of sends me, and I'm sure others, down so many other interesting avenues and journeys. So, this is something that I've always cherished. But we are now open for questions. I will please request you to write down any questions that you might have in the Ask a Question section at the bottom of your screen. And we will try our best to get to them. We are really looking forward to your questions. So
I think there are 3 questions already here.
Yes, there are. And 2 are from Lubaba.
Okay.
So for now,
I can address that.
Yeah, will you be looking to do more work? Yeah.
Do we have to read out the questions? We should, I guess.
Yes, we should.
Yeah. So the question is, will you be looking to do more work on Mughal women? And she's asking both me and Amrita that. And I think I am definitely interested in Mughal women. And I'm very interested in the figure of Jahan Ara, who was the daughter of Shah Jahan. And she was a phenomenal figure. She was the controller of the Surat port. She had her own trading companies. And she was a great patron of architecture. She is the one who had the Jami Mosque built in Agra. She, sponsored the, construction of many Mughal monuments. And the British write about her. I have to go back to the British Library. They write about her and giving her gifts. They called her Begum Sahib. So that's certainly, she is. And she also was a translator of the Sufis. She was a Sufi. And she wrote a biography of Muinuddin Chishti. She and her brother, Dara Shikoh, who was killed by Shah Jahan. So, and I think there's a lot of work to be done for that. I'll quickly answer one other question and then you can answer that. And that is from Ziad Ben Amour, who's talking about English and North Africans in the early modern period. And he talks about Jack Ward, who converted to Islam in Tunis and changed his name to Yusuf Rice. I don't know that. That's a very good question. And that's something that I will have to look into. And I think I would like to say that I really know very little about North Africa. And I think there's a lot of, other scholars and there's work to be done there. So why don't you go ahead?
Actually, I'm quite fascinated by the Yusuf Rice question and sort of thinking about how even in the Mughal world, right, you would have figures who would be transculturated. I mean, Jyotsna Hawkins, for instance, who you talk about a lot. I mean, who doesn't convert, but does become a mansabdar within the Mughal court. It does become one of Jahangir's mansabdars, and so sort of very much throws open the specter of transculturation, if not conversion. Wouldn't you say, Jyotsna?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's even conversion, as people who write on conversion, is a very complex process. So certainly, I think there are lots of areas and work to be done on, conversion, and there are people here who have done that. But I agree with you. I think the William Hawkins was a very interesting story. That if you really read between the lines, what was the relationship between him and Jahangir, and in terms of
Yeah.
conversion. And in terms of conversion, we know that the Jesuits always believed that the Mughals would convert and their children would convert. There's a story that Jahangir's children would become Catholics, Christians. And then there's one Mughal governor who secretly converts. So I think, thanks for the reference. And I think that's a very good point here.
Poonam Trivedi has two amazing questions.
Okay.
So her first question is the question of music in The Tempest is vital. I've been looking at a 19th century Bengali translation, Nolini Boshanto by Hemchandra, and music plays an intrinsic role in the adaptation.
I
And
think that's
Jyotsna, would you like to comment on the contentious relationship between the local and the global, where global seems to be erasing the local? So these are the two questions.
Thank you. I think the first question, Poonam, is we'll definitely consult you to talk about how the music has been used in The Tempest and different interpretations of it. And I think the wonderful production by Greg Doran, I think the 2006 RSE production, where he has all those digital technologies, that you have to have a completely different sense of the sounds. And as Caliban says, he's talking of the sounds of the island. So I think, and of course, for Bengali culture, the music would be so central, and how it would play a role in the adaptation process. And I think that's an article to be written. That would be very interesting. The local and the global, I don't know. I think I want to again refer to the work of Martin Orkin and another South African critic, Nick Visser. And Nick Visser wrote this amazing essay. He passed away some years ago, on land and King Lear, on the local land use and land grab under apartheid in King Lear, where he looks at very local practices of land appropriation by the white settlers and links it to notions of property in Lear. I think the film Heather very much mediates between the local and the global through the local poetry and the culture of Kashmiris. Your question is very good, Poonam, but I think, and there's a lot of scope of having productions, having students write on local topical issues within these adaptations. Go ahead,
If
Amrita.
I might just sort of butt in, so the question on 19th century Bangla translation is actually by Shormishta Paja. My apologies. For some reason, the name wasn't showing up. Yeah, so that's Shormishta Paja's question, not Poonam Trivedi's question. Poonam Trivedi's question is the one on local and global.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks, Shormishta. That's a great, and I look forward to reading your work. There's another question. How can there be a paradigm shift in how we teach Renaissance in India? Currently, in the English departments, particularly, the focus on British history is tremendous, and one does not hear of global travels or global Renaissance at all. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about the pedagogical changes that should address this. Well, thank you for your question. This is, I think, Nianta. And I, don't teach in India. And I think that's a thing that the Indian departments have to address. And I'm sure Poonam and Paramita are teaching those. So it depends on your department. I would say that people in India should look at local productions or what they global trade or global renaissance at all. I think maybe you could introduce travel narratives. I know that the curriculum in India are very structured and they're made from the top, and it's hard to change pedagogy in departments. Maybe Amrita can address this, since you teach in India now.
Well, the CBCS system does pose difficulties, but I actually regularly teach the global renaissance to my master's students. So even if they are reading texts like Kids Spanish Tragedy, I sort of go in straight out and sort of tell them that's actually the context for it, and that is how I situate the text, and I sort of pull out uh, the moments of empire out of uh, the play text, but I do it with other texts as well. So my response or reaction is that although the texts themselves are fixed and our hands are often tied, so just to give a context to those of our auditors who are not from India, uh, we don't really have too much of freedom when it comes to curriculum development, and we cannot design our own courses in India in the same way that one is able to in North America, for instance. I don't know too much about the UK system, so I will not sort of. I don't know too much about the UK system, so I won't presume to speak a lot about it. But my reaction to this is that we do have freedom in the way that we teach it, and I think we can introduce these ideas, and then there are always conferences and seminars that I think one can use to push against the rhetoric. But might I also add, digital archives, digital repositories, I think can also act as a really useful tool in this, especially during the pandemic years when most teaching has gone online, where if there's a particular play, I can actually send them to watch uh, an adaptation that is not Eurocentric, and sort of get them to think about it, and that also serves as part of asynchronous learning.
Okay.
So yeah,
Yeah.
one can innovate.
I just want to add one thing. I think one really good result of all this interest in the last few years has been on pedagogy. Pedagogy was never considered a respectable topic in the old days at conferences. Now, and I would applaud places like the Folger Shakespeare Library, Newberry Library, the Shakespeare Association, the RSA, Renaissance Society, all are bringing pedagogy and application to the fore. So I think that is a very welcome change. And I wanted to add another term. We talk my department, we are looking at anti-racist pedagogy, pedagogy that addresses issues of justice and equity. And another term I like to introduce is pedagogy that focuses on cultural intelligibility, is students learning about other cultures. And for instance, when I teach Heather in the US, I have to have spent a lot of time talking about Kashmir and the politics there. So that's something that those of us doing global renaissance can also share and teach people about other cultures in that sense. So I think that's would be something that would certainly be there. Other uh, questions, comments? I would love to hear from people who disagree with me or some other point of view.
I think the question about whether the global seems to be erasing the local is still up there.
Okay. Well, It depends where is it in India, is it in the US, where it is erasing. My sense is that I think a lot of voices are being kind of unleashed here. Like in the US, we're talking of border studies, we're talking of work by Ruben Espinosa that's looking at the border communities and Shakespeare and some productions of Shakespeare. There's a lot of local voices. So I'm not sure if you have a specific reference to, if you have a specific reference to where and how that was happening. I don't know. Poonam is still there. No, I think she may have gone.
And actually, talking about digital resources that look at pedagogy and specifically pedagogic questions, and I think also address the local aspect of it, is the Shakespeare in Bengal sort of project by Paramita Deep, so by Professor Paramita Chakraborty of Jadavpur University, which is actually sort of combines oral history and sort of contains interviews and records of how Shakespeare has been taught traditionally in the Indian classrooms. And I think, going back to Niyanta's question, I think sort of collected histories, collected archival knowledge of how Shakespeare has been taught traditionally in the Indian classroom settings might also help us figure out future ways in regarding how we might negotiate
Sure.
the
Yeah.
big part of the curriculum with the new innovative things that we obviously want our students to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the role is all of us in our classroom. And I think since we're almost out of time, I'll kind of end with simply saying that, coming after doing Shakespeare so many years, I really go back to the plays more and more. I think the real politics is in the affective experience of the plays. I teach less theory, and I think it's the plays that will bring about the change, and it's the plays that will shape our consciousness and help us to build empathy and for characters, for people. I taught a Measure for Measure last year with productions that were very radical, the Cheek by Jowl production. And finally, I think since there's almost time, I shouldn't end before giving a plug for all the fine work that is being done on stage. On directors like Iqbal Khan, whose work I've used a lot, his Much Ado, his Othello, and amazing work that's being done at the Globe and the RSC. The Globe, read by Farah Kareem Cooper, is doing work. So that's the place where a lot of the kind of writing I did, 20 years ago, is coming to fruition. And Murat has put, there's a call for papers by Multicultural Shakespeare Journal, which I am the advisory. So that's another place. So you can say film, performance, scholarship, pedagogy. They're all different arenas. And because of occasions like this, I think we can bring them together. So coming back to our edition of the Tempest, I think we want to kind of that to reflect the world in which the Tempest exists today and the way it's being disseminated to audiences across. So I think we're time's winged chariot
Yes.
here. Thank you so much. Thanks, Amrita and Lubaba. And it's so wonderful to see so many friends. And, I'm sure these conversations will continue. There's one other question. I'll end it with. There's a question from Matt.
Yes.
Matt, you talked eloquently. The Tempest has bookended your career. Could you say a little more how your thinking of the play has changed? And I think my thinking of the play has changed in two ways. That's a really good question. One is I want to immerse myself in the atmosphere of the play. I never did earlier. I never thought, for instance, of the music and the sounds. And I think that the play was created for us to evoke the world. And the world also seen through Caliban's eyes, because we always just read Prospero's narrative. So I want to have a more affective experience of The Tempest rather than reading it simply as the colonized. Exactly. The isle is full of noises. To me, that's the most pregnant line now. And the second line is when Caliban talks about his dreams. Because earlier on, I used to always think of, this island's mine by my mother. That I always thought of it in very harsh political terms. That's where I've become a Sufi, Matt, is I want to think of some way of The Tempest that is politically still liberating, but that's beyond the binaries. So this will be a kind of Sufi vision. And I think I want to just say it seriously. I think the last few years has seen too much contention and too much ideological fixities. We all need to free ourselves from these ideological agendas. Look, we're seeing what's happening in the world these days with ideological agendas. And so I want to approach literature not through ideological agendas anymore. So I'll end with that. Thank you so much, very much, all of you.
Thank you. And I'm really looking forward to this new collection on The Tempest. And Shomishta Pancha, I'm also looking forward to reading your essay on Tempest and music. So lots of exciting work out there that we are truly privileged to be a part of, and
Yeah.
it's a true privilege for us to read. And Jyotsna, thank you so very, very much for joining us, for sparing the time to have this conversation with us. Special thanks to Society for Renaissance Studies and to MEMOs and everyone on the amazing MEMOs team
Thank
for
you
making this possible.
for the Society of Renaissance, and to everyone. This was wonderful, and it's sort of clear. And here's Jennifer Wood talking about soundscapes. Yes, Jennifer, your book is an inspiration. Her book is in our transculturalism series called Sounding Otherness. So if you haven't read it, a plug for that. And I think she let us out of the room, right? There'll be some protocol.
No. Well, we are still in the room. So
Okay.
yes, we can totally talk about Jennifer's amazing book on sound, and
Yeah.